Hey folks, Steve here with a special review video for you today. We are going to be looking at End of Empire, published by Compass Games, designed by William Marsh. Um, and This is one that we've been playing on the channel here for a little bit. So just to get a couple of things out of the way, this review will be based on, well, a whole bunch of stuff. We played a lot of scenarios that came from outside of the game, from supplemental material. We also played the American Revolution scenario, which is the primary big deal scenario of the game, twice actually, and I almost played a third because I was willing to do that, which is maybe a spoiler for the rest of the review. But I decided that there's still more for me to dig into in this game in terms of just all the strategies and ways to play that I'm going to save it for the future, because I do expect or hope to play this opposed at one point. But just a reminder, this review is based on solitaire play. Fortunately, I think this game does allow for solitaire pretty easily, because you're very usually making decisions that are just the best that you can do, and the dice will handle things how fate will decide. A couple of things just in terms of the context of this game. This game used to be a magazine game. It was originally published in the 90s, and the box here from Compass is sort of like a deluxe edition printing with revamped map and counter artwork, different from the original magazine version. Now, at the time of this video, about mid-October 2022, this game is still for sale on Compass Games' website, but it has a marker on it that says limited stock. So if you're watching this and you watch the rest of this review video and you think you might enjoy the game, I encourage you to please go and order while you can, because I believe once this goes out of print, I have no idea how soon we'll see any sort of reprint, if that will ever even be in the cards. So it's a bit of a challenge to do a review and a video for a game that may not be available in the primary market for much longer, but there's always the opportunity for the secondary market, folks that are selling their copies, what have you. Now we'll do this review video like I usually do. We'll take a look at the mechanics in further depth in the middle section of the video. If you want to skip past that, I'll show a timestamp that you can skip to if you just want to see and hear my final thoughts on the game. If you want to see a much more detailed look at the game mechanics, then you can watch my playthrough videos. I did create a specific playlist for those videos, and I set it up in chronological order, so you can watch all of the early scenarios that you can play with supplemental material all the way up through the American Revolution. I will say that for that content, what is in the box, if you were to purchase the game, is the American Revolution, the French and Indian War, and basically King George's War, which was basically the War of Austrian Succession, but the American theater. There are other scenarios. So there are a few variant scenarios that are available in Paper Wars issue 86. There are also post-publication scenarios that you can get from Consim World, is where I downloaded the files from, which includes the scenario information as well as a page containing counters that you can print and set up yourself, so sort of print and play if you're of the inclination to do that. I did that. It was very easy to print that on sticker paper and sort of cut them out and apply the stickers to spare counters that I had that I've cultivated over the years. So that worked out pretty well for me. I would recommend the same if you decide to go down that path. Before I break here in the video, I do want to make a special call out to Tom Swider, who generally is engaged heavily on the forums, both on Board Game Geek and Consim World for this game. Big applause to Tom. I think it's important to call out people who support a game that technically they have no responsibility for. Tom's not the developer, but he's sort of become a post-publication fan developer, as sometimes that happens in our space, where he has done his best to cultivate updated rules and basically look after the vassal module. And so Tom has been a stalwart person answering questions where he can online or engaging with the designer where he can get attention to get rules clarifications. And in fact, probably the most important thing that comes from this is for this review, should have mentioned this earlier, I guess, but I'm hitting it now. I did use the Minuteman Living Rules. So these are available online. They are basically the living rules for the game, technically unofficial because Tom sort of put this together, called it the Minuteman Living Rules, and put them up. They are generally endorsed by the designer, I think, at this point, as just a way to get the latest rules clarifications and errata in the rulebook. He did a really good job putting this together. It is a rock solid rules update. Now, I printed this out at home, and I actually have my own comb binding machine, and I bound this myself. Other folks may have limited access, but you can always use the PDF. It feels weird to include this as part of the review to just say, like, hey, you could use the rules as written, but almost all war games have updates, have living rules, all of that, and it just, for me, was easier to print out the latest rules and use them at the table. So I would encourage you, if you have the game and you want to play it and you haven't done so yet, or you're thinking about getting this game, I would just earmark that it will be very beneficial for you to print out those rules somehow. Whether you go to like a UPS store or something else, it is definitely recommended here. But we'll get into all the other specifics of the rules here very shortly. So kind of a long intro, but I want to set the stage. This game's been kind of taking up my gaming life for the past few weeks. Wanted to give it its due. So we'll now jump over to the in-depth explanation of mechanics, or at least as deep as we can go in a hopefully not too long of a video. And then again, we'll show the timestamp for the final thoughts and true review aspect of this video. Okay, so we're going to look at the game components and kind of talk about the mechanics very briefly. I'm going to go free cam, so it may seem a little shaky at times as I pan around the table. I do want to show this game basically is a map, two maps connected at the end, so it's one very long map, as opposed to, say, two maps connected on the wide ends. And so what you have is basically the eastern part of what would become the United States, the eastern part of North America, where we have Louisiana down here and parts of Florida, and then all along the coast, and Nova Scotia, and Canada. The terrain on the map is kind of interesting to interpret. They have these mountain hexes. These are impassable terrain, so it creates these channels along the map. Generally, you have a lot of this green wilderness, and strewn about are the rivers, which do affect movement. So there's plenty of wilderness. It's a catch-all, so you don't have things like forested hills or rough terrain. It is a clear difference between wilderness and then basically what they call civilized hexes, which are these ones here, and these sort of yellow, you can see like there's a pattern like pastures or fields, roads in these hexes that are civilized. And it's important to look at this in terms of what they represent. Here there is rough terrain, rough civilized terrain that is representing the terrain around New York. So that is like a one, I guess, specific difference. But basically it's drawing a clear line between what is considered wilderness versus not wilderness. And this factors to a lot of what the game system has to offer. Where there is combat that occurs in the wilderness, sort of referred to as ambush combat, or you can think of it as wilderness combat, and then linear combat. So you can have linear combat in wilderness, but only after a potential ambush combat has occurred, while in the civilized hexes, you're only going to have linear combat. And we'll talk about how that factors in with the units here shortly, but I do want to touch upon the political element of this. So this game does represent certain political realities during different scenarios. So some of those change scenario to scenario, but generally speaking, if we just want to use the American Revolution as the main campaign, what the British have to worry about is all these civilized hexes are friendly to the rebels, the patriots, the Continental Army, and such. So when the British forces are moving around the map, they have to pay a higher movement point cost to move through these civilized hexes more than the American player. And so that can be very important in terms of just navigating the table space. Wilderness will cost the same for both sides. One other important thing here is there is a division on the map. So basically anything south of this is the south map. Anything north of this is the north map. And that is where winter stops, basically. So anything on the south map during winter does not have its terrain modified. It is not harder to activate units to move and do combat, which we'll talk about activation here very shortly. But in the north, you do have to worry about winter. So generally, terrain costs are doubled, and most leaders are not going to be able to activate, or it's going to be much harder to activate leaders in the winter due to those weather constraints. Both maps will have supply checked during winter turns, but it's just that on the south map, because it doesn't get as cold, right? They don't have the terrain and activation penalties. So you can see it. There are segmentations between the colonies. So, North Carolina, Virginia. This will tend to matter for certain game functions like when militia are available. And part of one of the British victory conditions is reliant on the British basically capturing all the supply hexes that belong to the Americans in that state and causing British colonial government rule to be reinstated. So you can see there are different features on the map. The anchor denotes a port, which is important for a number of different factors, which we can get into. You'll also see those little boxes. These represent there are towns present, towns big enough to impact gameplay here on the map. The little soldier guys indicate that this is an entry hex, which means that there are some units for one of the sides. So you can see here there's some for the British, some for the Americans that enter in that hex. And if the enemy controls that hex, it's very likely that those units are not going to be able to come in as reinforcements. So that's another way that the map kind of guides strategy. And then these little barrels with the flag means that is a supply hex for the Americans. And very important to note that New York, right here, is a supply hex for the British. So something to watch out for there in the big scheme of the game. And you can see just as I pan out, there are a lot of supply hexes, there are a lot of entry hexes, which means for the British trying to stamp out the rebellion, they've got to cover a lot of ground. Now, in other scenarios like the French and Indian War, those civilized hexes will generally be in favor of the British and bad for the French, where up here at the St. Lawrence River area, the French civilized hexes just look a little bit different. They use more of a white color as opposed to this yellow color. So just something you want to watch out for there. The one special exception is Halifax is sort of an orange color. It is a civilized hex that is basically always friendly to the British, which is appropriate given the circumstances. Now, that's a general look at the map and just how things operate. And generally speaking, movement is either going to be 1 or 2 movement points per hex for the civilized. If you're moving along a river, that can be reduced to just 1. If you're moving through the river of a wilderness, through the river in wilderness, a wilderness hex by itself is 5 movement points. Along the river is 2. So the rivers are definitely the highways of the game map, and you'll definitely want to be paying attention to how to use the rivers to move forces. They're also basically your lifeblood for supply. So if you had a unit that was hanging out up here at Fort Ticonderoga, you would be tracing supply along waterways to a supply hex. So along these lakes to this river, the Hudson, either back to a supply hex, or maybe, you're tracing north up through here to a port like Quebec for the British. So all of that ends up factoring in quite a bit. You also have certain factors with those towns. So when you're talking about a hex that has a town like, let's just say White Plains, for an example, a stack of units can be there, and you can opt to either have them be like in generally the hex, or they can be in the town. And so when they're like that, it's sort of treated as its own sort of place that they've located themselves in, which means that an enemy maybe could come into the hex but not the town. And so that stack is on top of the town. The units inside the town are underneath the town marker. But generally, units that are going to be inside a town want to fortify it, which requires activation. And if they get a fortification marker, basically provides a bonus in combat on defense, which can be pretty powerful. But being in a fort like that, particularly in a coastal hex, could sometimes be an issue, especially if, I'm sorry, well, I guess White Plains is not a port. What matters is a port. So for some reason, the British are all holed up in New York, say, and they need to retreat, but they are in a fortified hex. Maybe I should use the red-orange fortification marker. And there's a French fleet in the North Atlantic, and we'll talk about the fleets too. They could get stuck and have to surrender. So there's a lot of interesting rules that cover this stuff. I'm not going to reiterate the entire rule book so that you guys, don't have to have me here forever. But it's just an important thing. You definitely want to read through the rules and kind of understand how these mechanics all work together. Some other important things just to show, there are these sort of, I think that's supposed to be a quill and a tomahawk, if I am reading that right, if that's how I interpret that. These represent Native American villages. So these will be where Native American units, and let me make sure I grab one that's going to make sense, where Native American units will enter and operate from in the game. So you can see there's an example, Mohawk Indian. Now, we'll talk about the units here for a second. The first number on a counter is going to be its linear combat value. So this Native American unit is not good at linear combat. It has a 0. But its second number, which in any other war game you might think of as like a defense value, that is its wilderness combat value. So 2 is pretty good for just a unit. There are units with better values, but there's not many. And it has a plus next to it. So what this means is that this unit has 2 combat factors for the wilderness ambush combat, but the plus means they can actually ambush. So if they move during their movement into a stack that does not have any ambush or any offensive ambush factors, so you're looking to attack a stack that may have that number in the middle but no plus sign, this guy could move as long as it's in wilderness terrain. And we'll just, I don't know, let's say for some reason these guys are out here. Well, these guys could move in and attack them. So it'd be 2-2, 1-1 on the ambush combat results table. But that could be performed by that British allied Native American unit against the militia. And it's very likely that militia would be defeated. Now, this combat probably would never happen in a real world context, but just so you guys can see how it compares. And you can see some of the linear factors on some of these units gets quite large. The boxed number means that it's halved on attack. So in scenarios like, say, the French and Indian War, where both sides have Native American units, control of the villages is its own thing. The ability to strike at the villages, this causes these Native American units to go home or to be withdrawn from the map. Typically, when they've caused a combat loss in combat, they will go home anyway. So the way that the Native American system usually works is that depending on what scenario you're playing, you're going to roll dice every reinforcement phase to see if you recruit Native American units as long as you meet the requirements. So in some of these scenarios, control of certain hexes like Montreal or Albany are important. Again, that's sort of adding an element of political stuff to the rules more than just this is a hex encounter military sim, because holding these cities represents strength in the region and makes you as the player more attractive to that Native American tribe to have an ally, have an alliance, have a relationship such that you are capable of recruiting these units. And then they're usually a one and done. They're going to perform an action. Hopefully, they will have helped you eliminate some enemy units or cut off supply or whatever. But once they've had been in a combat with some combat loss, they're usually going to come off the board and go home. But you usually have the opportunity to try to recruit them again on a later turn. So they're definitely this auxiliary force that can be very powerful if used correctly, but the game situations tend to change over time. And if you say in the American Revolution, do very well as the Americans and capture Montreal, Montreal ends up being a very important hex for Native American ally recruitment. You can shut down a lot of the British Native American support by taking Montreal and keeping it. That can have a dramatic effect on the game. Your run of the mill units, we'll just use some British as an example. You can see by comparison, a lot of these infantry units have okay linear combat factors, none for ambush. And then the third number, which we haven't talked about, is movement, but you can see the movement, it tends to be quite high. So on any given turn, a unit can at least go like 4 wilderness hexes or a whole bunch of civilized hexes. Just to show, if we're talking about an American unit working through friendly territory, you could go from Wilmington 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 to Philadelphia in one turn with one activation. So just throwing that out there. But going back to these units, you can see these are broadly infantry. They are, some of them are 1-step units, some of them are 2-step. So that number to the left there is the number of steps, which means this guy has a reversed side. The rest of these guys with a 1 do not. These are British regulars, which tend to matter a lot for victory. You can see that it's a very general set of combat factors. The NATO symbol actually matters quite a lot because you can see there's the dot in the middle that signifies artillery. So it's an infantry regiment with artillery. And artillery affects combat. If you are fighting an enemy without artillery and you have artillery, it's basically a bonus for you in that combat as long as you're fighting in civilized terrain. So the British have a certain advantage of that. You also have your leaders here. So we've got a couple of example leaders. The first number is their bonus to combat. So you can see these guys don't have much that way. The second number is their priority, seniority. So the lower the number, the higher they are in seniority, which means that if these guys were in a stack with no other leaders, Percy is a higher rank, better rank than Peugeot. And so, or however that's pronounced, I'm sorry if I get that wrong, Percy would be the commander, the commanding general, because his number is lower. And then finally, the third number is their activation rating. So anytime you want to activate a stack in this game, you've got a roll to activate. This is what makes Solitaire work really well for this game, because you just are hoping stuff activates. If you're trying to activate a stack with no leader, there's assumed to be a default leader with a value of 2. So on a die roll, assuming it's not winter, you need to roll a 2 or a 1 to activate that stack. In winter, that command rating of 2, it's the default 2, would be 0, because in winter on the north map, you subtract 2 from an initiative rating. As you can see, these leaders here are only slightly better than the default leader. Only slightly better. But they'll activate about half the time. So if you look at a turn as, it's really 6 turns per year, and only 4, is it 6 turns per year? Yes, it's 6 turns per year, and really only 4 of them are non-winter turns. You're only going to get maybe, on average, 2 activations for this stack if they didn't have any better leader. Now we're using holding boxes, and these guys are in fact with Gage in Boston. But Gage is no better. So really, these guys aren't going to activate very frequently. The game shifts as new leaders come onto the board or leaders die, and they can die in combat. And so there's always this shift of who's able to operate, and you always have to play with the understanding that wherever your guys go, they may not get to activate next turn, and you don't want to get them stuck in a lurch. So a lot of stuff gets involved there in terms of strategy and what you're trying to do in any given scenario. Now the fleets are interesting. There are fleet availability charts so that on any given turn there's some die roll chance that a fleet will be available. The French fleet is only available once the French enter on the American side in that American Revolution scenario. Other scenarios have their own sort of fleet availability chart. But when you get a fleet and it's available, you'll place it in a sea zone. So there's like North Atlantic, there's Gulf of Maine, and so on. And basically what this will mean is that this fleet will allow an army of yours on the coast to evacuate and retreat instead of retreating along the coast or whatever. You can just retreat onto the port. You also need to have a fleet in a sea zone if you want to navally land a force somewhere in the sea zone hexes, or the hexes on the sea zone. So if we wanted to drop the British in New York, we would need to make sure our fleet is in the North Atlantic, and then we can have a stack of units land somewhere. Now it only has to be in the destination. So in theory, we could move a stack from Halifax all the way over to New York as long as the fleet was here. The fleet just being the primary driver of where things are going to land or where your evacuation capability is from. When you have a case where both players have decided to put their fleets in the same sea zone, you're going to have yourself a naval battle. And I'm going to grab some dice. Here's your naval battle rules. The French win. The British fleet goes away for a while. Fleets are never fully destroyed. But you can see it's just a straight die roll. So when the French fleet and the British fleet are both able to enter the game, that can be a pretty big deal. And you can have a decent chance that the French will win, and then all of a sudden the British lose a tremendous advantage that they have in the American Revolution scenario. Obviously, other scenarios, a very similar kind of situation can come up there. And that's where you get your Yorktown victories, and everything else is through the fleet. So they're very powerful, but the ability to count on them isn't always there. So it's an element of the surprise of the game over time. Now, there are tons of other nuances and other rules that I could hit here, guys, but I don't think it makes sense to go super, super deep in all of these things, other than just to say that, there are rules for militia. So generally in the American Revolution, the Americans can call upon these militia units. If they're destroyed, they can get them back. And they can just pop up. So as soon as the British enter a civilized hex in, say, Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania militia can appear right where they entered and force a combat to delay them. And after combat, if a stack wants to continue moving, they have to roll to activate again. So the activation game is a huge part of this, where a good leader is going to activate frequently and will be slowed down less by militia popping up like that. But bad leaders could very easily get slowed down and be caught in a very vulnerable position. The rest of the political rules, again, will vary from game to game, but for the American Revolution, the big ones are going to be related to victory and how victory is adjudicated. Basically, what you're going to typically be trying to do as the British is either try to, conquer the colonies, which I feel is almost impossible. It's more likely what you're going to want to do is keep Lord North's government from falling and causing the American economy to collapse. So how do you do that? Well, every winter, starting in 1777, you're going to count up all the ports, and there's only so many ports here in the colonies, that are either held by the British, which means, there's an actual unit here, or has been raided, in which case you put a raid marker. Raided means that when you check this economic situation at the end of each year, you look at all the other turns from that calendar year and see if the British had entered through them at any one time. If they did, place a port rated marker. So what you should really do is, say in spring, this unit was in Norfolk and say it got eliminated or it left, you just put the port rated marker there right away, and we leave it there until the winter turn at the end of the year, and we count that as 1 point. If this unit stayed in Norfolk, that would count for 2 points. So you can almost see, a situation where the British, rather than trying to hold on to ports that they can't realistically hold on to very long, they might go on a raiding campaign and just try to move through these ports to put the raid markers down. What you do is you add up those points. So again, 2 if it's occupied by the British, 1 if it was raided. You add up your grand total across the 19 ports that are in North America, the colonies of North America. And then you divide that number by 5. You round to the nearest whole number, and that is a die roll modifier on a collapse table. Now, I'm not going to bother to show that table. I think I'm kind of going verbose on you here already. But basically, the Americans in the American Revolution scenario are fighting against the collapse of their economy as the British are blockading, they're taking control of territory. They can offset that penalty to the die roll by having French entry, in which case you can nullify a lot of that. And it basically just means that the American economy stays afloat for longer. And as long as they can do that, they have a bigger army. If near economic collapse happens, which is one of the conditions, then they lose the Americans lose like half their army. If you have full economic collapse, then they lose most of their army, half their army, and basically they can't supply the rest of the army, and so they're going to basically have no army. And as long as the British can keep Lord North's government from falling, then they'll win the game that way. Now, how does Lord North's government fall? Well, Lord North's government falls when, I believe it's, and I might have the number wrong, I don't have it right in front of me, it's like 35 British regular steps have been eliminated completely off the board. So the types of units in this game can sometimes matter a great deal. So these are British regulars. There are other units that the British player will have access to that they could have take step losses instead, so they can protect these British regulars. And this just represents, the British want to get through this war without losing too many men, because they don't want to be weakened against France on the global stage. They don't want to be humiliated. And so as long as Lord North's government can remain stable, because the British aren't losing that way, they can potentially win. But if the Americans can force that to occur by eliminating enough units, then that'll be a trigger for the end game. Also related here is the French entry. So French entry is very similar, where the Americans need to have permanently eliminated British regulars, with the steps number being 20. So the Americans need to try in the first half of the game to remove 20 steps off the map completely. That way French entry occurs and they can offset any economic collapse chances that could be occurring. And then to win the game, they need to basically keep their economy together and eliminate, several more steps of British regulars. And that's an easy way to summarize it, but there's so much more there, guys, in the actual scenario itself as you're playing across the entirety of the map to play through and experience. The American Revolution scenario is certainly the main scenario of this game, and you should definitely look at it as the reason to buy the game. I feel like a lot of people play the French and Indian War scenario, which is for sure a fun scenario, don't get me wrong, but the main scenario to play is the American Revolution. And because there's so many more units in this scenario than there are in French and Indian War or any other scenario, concerns about will my units activate enough with the die rolls and the activation ratings, that tends to get mitigated because you just have so many more units, so many more leaders, that you're every turn moving something and doing something on the board that is important. Now, the Minuteman rules that were put together by Tom Swider do address some clarifications that exist in the game. I suspect there's always going to be a need for some level of clarifications. There are certain nuances of the rules that aren't always immediately clear, and I wish it was more precise and absolutely flawless than it is, but generally the rules are not terribly difficult to consume and appreciate. The one thing I will say is the counterweight of this game is pretty good, and so much so that I made my own reinforcement chart to keep track of all the units that come onto the board. But here's the one special thing that I think makes this game significant. Every counter is a specific unit that existed. So you can see, it's like the 11th Massachusetts Regiment, the 14th Massachusetts, the whatever that is over there, and hey, look, there's Benedict Arnold, and oh gosh, look, there's the Royal, I forget what RHE is, but everything in this game is something significant, something worth calling out. The 94th Regiment, the 86th Regiment, the West Florida Rangers. I mean, like, every unit is something. So as opposed to a lot of other games where maybe you're dealing with generic strength points or maybe some very basic unit differentiation, every unit in this game has been thought about, has been given its historical designation, has been thought about where they're going to be raised, how strong they are. All of these things factor into the game, and I think it is one of the special marks for the game. It does potentially mean there's more fiddliness, where you've got to look at where does this unit come in. The replacement rules for the American Continentals force you to look at a unit and say, if he took a step loss, can he restore to full strength? Well, he's got to trace back to his source hex. Can he do that? Well, where's his source hex? That sounds like that would be a pain in the butt, but in actual play, it actually wasn't bad at all. It was kind of easy because the way that the map is situated, like, you're going to know, oh, this is a Massachusetts unit. How are we doing in Massachusetts? Are the British all up in here? Well, if no, and there's no other like bottlenecks of tracing, that unit is going to be able to trace back to its source hex and get a replacement. It's really not as bad as I thought it was going to be. So there's a little bit of fiddliness, sure, and that those stacks of counters look really mean and nasty. The reality is, in actual play, it wasn't so bad. The one thing I'll say is, because you're counting up a lot of factors here, like, okay, 3, 6, 9, 12, 16, 19, 20, 23, 29, and then 32, plus on defense it's 35, but on offense it's only 34. You get into these like, oh, okay, I got to count this all up again. Some whiteboard usage is probably warranted, maybe note cards or sheets of scrap paper like I used to help mark what strengths stacks are currently at. And there's a bunch of nuances. I covered some of the stuff in my playthrough videos of how, like, the Americans can take step losses better than the British because their combat factors don't change. There's a bunch of that stuff, but you generally are going to want to have a little bit of note paper to just help keep track of what's going on in the combats as the numbers change, and whether or not the odds ratio is going to change, which is going to govern the combat. Now, the combat, this is a long video already. I didn't talk too deeply on combat. Basically, initiating combat is going to cost 5 movement points, and then you're going to do an odds calculation and you're going to roll some dice. The main modifiers tend to be the artillery one I mentioned earlier, the fortifications. If you're in a fortification, you get a bonus. And then I guess this really depends on what scenario you're playing, but for the American Revolution, the Americans go through a number of reforms that get rid of penalties that they suffer for the first good chunk of the game. You can see these are the results. So the results before the slash are how many steps the attacker loses. The number of steps after the slash are the defender. There will also be a marker whether or not somebody needs to retreat. If the attacker has to retreat, then they have to pass initiative to go again. If they have enough movement points, they can reinitiate combat. And then if the defender wants to retreat and they didn't receive a retreat result, the defender has to pass an initiative check to withdraw in good order and retreat, wherever they want to go. So there's a little bit here. You can see even 1-to-1 combats are worth rolling, even sometimes 1 to 3 results are worth rolling just because you're going to start doing some step losses to the enemy. And there's one important bit of errata that I should mention. You should always look at errata for games, but one super important. In combat, if you take step losses, the first step loss, you get to pick which unit takes the step loss. If you lose more than one, you get to pick the first one, but your opponent picks the rest. So if you're ever in an unfortunate situation where you take 3 step losses, you can pick the first one. Your opponent is going to take the other 2. He's going to pick which other 2 step losses. And against the British, that usually means finding one of these guys and popping them off the board to add to that counter for French entry in the fall of Lord North's government. So that's another factor that's really important. My gosh, this is really long, guys. I'm so sorry. But this game has a lot of nuances. I feel like I should explain them because I think this game is a little bit overlooked. So anyway, I can't capture everything that's in this game, guys, especially when you account for the post-publication scenarios, all the additional stuff that's been released. But what I will say is that the system is generally pretty good in being able to just operate and play. It's also adaptable, which is why all these post-publication scenarios exist. So you can play other conflicts on this continent using the same basic system with occasional tweaks, and it still works pretty darn good the whole way through, or at least it's the same level of fidelity the whole way through. So I think we'll wrap this section up here, and we'll go back to the front to talk about my final thoughts on this game and my general review. Okay, so what did I think of the game? Well, before I played this game, I had kind of a weird infatuation with it from way back when I first purchased it, because I thought it was just a very interesting idea of a game. The system intrigued me, and for years I kind of followed it. I looked at the forums. I messed around in Vassal without really playing it fully, and I knew that I figured I would like it, but I never got around to playing it. And now, having played it, I am enamored with the game. So it's going to be weird to review this. It's going to be hard to be objective, and maybe there's no review that is truly objective, and that's probably the case. But I have to give a bit of warning on this one, because I feel like my infatuation and my adoring of this game might blind me to some rough spots and may limit the applicability to someone watching this video. So for me, I really, really like this game. I have long sought a game on the American Revolution that provides some greater fidelity than, say, Washington's War. And I know that there are other games out there, but I had purchased this one and figured, well, maybe this one is it, and if I'm dissatisfied, then maybe I'll find a different game, because, again, there are others out there. But this one managed to get everything that I really wanted out of a game like that. So before anyone thinks I'm dissing on Washington's War, I really like Washington's War from GMT Games. I think it's a really great card-driven game. It's a really great game to introduce somebody to wargaming, because new folks like cards, and it's just a little more interactive for them than staring at hexes and counters and all of that. But Washington's War, for all of its greatness as a quick-playing, simpler game, it still misses some level of detail and strategic elements that I would want, and I think this game generally hits that for the American Revolution. All the additional scenarios that are available for it are like, cherry on top kind of thing, but truly I think the American Revolution scenario is the highlight of the package, and is certainly the one that the game system works best with in terms of just being able to play this nuanced game that takes strategy. There are a lot of different strategy options, as, like, say, the British. You can pursue a different type of victory, or you have a different way you decide you want to go high risk, high reward, or low risk, but there's certain things tied up with that. So I generally like that about the way the game played. I wanted an American Revolution game where the different phases of the war were there and felt direct, and this game had that, where I feel like the phases of the war aren't felt as cleanly in other games. This one, it's definitely there. I like that the different leaders are all there. I like that the units are represented, and you can have a really good differentiation. So a standard Continental Regiment is very substantively different from Daniel Morgan's rifles. And getting to see a unit that is a very particular unit from history, or something that has a little bit of a story behind it that you can go look at and read about, is a nice plus. Again, the fiddliness, and we talked about this in the gameplay section, there's a little bit of that. A little bit of trying to find the right hex, but you start to get good at understanding where those hexes are. You can read the map, you develop a sense of the map as you go, and it ended up really not being very bad. So for me, I'm just very pleased with this game. I'm set up to play another campaign of the American Revolution, but I had to hold myself back and say, Steve, leave something for the future. I want to come back to this game and play it again. Either solitaire or maybe opposed. I think would be very fun to play it opposed. And I don't want to have played this to death and I figured out all the strategies and all the perfect ways to respond. I want to still leave that to be discovered over time, though I think I've got a strong sense of the strategic options already. I want to leave some out there. So I definitely like this game. I like it a lot. I'm just like, oh, this was a lot of fun. This was so much fun, really. Honestly, it was. I had a lot of fun with it. But can I recommend it, without reservations to everybody? Probably not. So anybody who's watching this, take an opportunity to look at the Vassal module, take an opportunity to read the Minuteman rules, and really think through, are you going to jive with the activation system? Are you going to jive with the way supply works? Do some basic reading and comprehension or use my videos as the crutch, but understand if those systems are going to be okay with you, because I could definitely see where somebody bounces off of this game system because it just doesn't fit what they're looking for, or maybe they do want some card-driven aspect, or they want to handle historical events a different way than this game does. So it's like I'm like, oh gosh, this game's a 9 or a 10 out of 10. I just love it. I love this game. I love it like I love my pets. It's like everyone's got a dog, but I really love my dog, kind of thing. Like I like this game a lot. I just absolutely do. I had a lot of fun with it. It scratched a particular itch for me that needed scratched for a long time. Will it scratch an itch for you? I can't say that for certain. It's a lot easier for other games to just say, hey, this game's great, you should play it. This game is great, I think. But I can understand why it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea for what it represents and what it's trying to convey. So I highly recommend with reservations, which is an odd way to look at a game, but I really like it. This game feels a bit like it's a cult classic. The people who like it really like it, but it has gone underneath a lot of folks' radar. A lot of folks have been maybe uncertain about it, or maybe they've only played the French and Indian War, weren't sure what to think of it, and they sold it without playing the true experience of the American Revolution, which I could definitely see being the case. So, I really like it. I think it's a good game, and you should check it out. Given that as of today, in October 2022, the game is listed as limited stock on Compass Games' website, means your opportunity to buy a fresh, clean, unpunched copy may be dwindling. So if you think you want to join the cult classic following of this one, now is your time. If you're watching this video far flung into the future, maybe look on the secondary market. I absolutely believe, and I say this for a lot of other games too, particularly the ones that are out of print that I've played, I do believe this game deserves an additional printing. So while this could be considered the sort of deluxe edition, we need a super redux deluxe edition. I don't know if we'll ever get to see that. I know the designer has a very busy life outside of wargaming. He doesn't do other designs. Like, this is kind of his, main design game that he designed, period. Um, but I think we should get another one, guys. I think we should get another printing. I think we need to include all the post-publication scenarios, all the stuff from Paper War should be in the box, all the erratas should be incorporated. Tom Swider should be included as a developer for all the hard work he's done already and to help refine what's there, to finalize it, to make it pristine and perfect the way this game ought to be. That's a pie in the sky. I'm very happy that I have what I have and that I have the post-publication scenarios and the counters that I put together for some of the other stuff there. And I think all of that's easily able to be put together by you if you get your own copy. But boy, I hope this game gets another printing. It deserves to get another pass and be in stock and plentiful and polished up even more to be a great game experience. But what Steve wants isn't necessarily what we'll all get, but I do hope that for this one. Let's see, anything else before we wrap up? I think that's it. This was a good game experience. I'm really glad I got this one to the table, guys. It was a long time coming, and I have to thank Just a Guard, and you should be watching his channel if you watch mine, because he played the French and Indian War, and that just inspired me to say, dang it, let me take this game off the shelf. We're doing it. We're going to do it. I got inspired by that, and it all worked together, all came together and worked really well. So thank you to Just a Guard. And by the way, yeah, go if you're subscribed to me and you're not subscribed to Just a Guard, just take a moment, open a new tab in your browser, look up Just a Guard. It's JUSTEGARDE, I think, and hit subscribe. He does a great job with his videos. He definitely puts some thought into the production of his videos. You should definitely check him out. If you're subscribed to me, you should be subscribed to him. He's got a lot of great content still coming out now and off into the future. So anyway, guys, I think that's it for this one. Again, I highly recommend. I really had a wonderful time with this game. I hope you would too if you give it a shot. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section down below. If you heartily disagree, I'm good with having a well-mannered discussion on that. And if you also like the game, I want to hear that too, or any other thoughts or questions. I'll do what I can to answer those. And that'll be it. So thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. And until next time, take care and keep on gaming.